Have you ever felt like you know all the right things about your faith, but something's still missing? Well, that's exactly what we're digging into in this explainer on A.W. Tozer's classic, The Pursuit of God. We're going to explore his challenge to move beyond just knowing the right answers to actually knowing God, in a real, personal way.
Tozer kicks things off with this really powerful image. The hungry sheep look up and are not fed. He's pointing out this massive problem he saw in the modern church, a kind of spiritual starvation happening right in plain sight. He saw people who had everything, sitting at the Father's table, but they were still just desperate for a genuine encounter with God.
Okay, so that's the big question we're exploring. What's causing this great disconnect? Tozer gives us a roadmap to get from just knowing about God to truly experiencing him. And that's the journey we're about to go on.
And this, right here, is really the heart of Tozer's whole argument. On one side, you've got a faith where God is just a correct idea, an inference you'd made from some doctrines. But on the other side, you have a faith that treats God like a living, breathing reality, a person you can actually know with, conscious awareness. It's the difference between having a blueprint and having a real relationship. So here's the absolute game changer. God isn't some cosmic principle or an abstract force. He's a person. And just like any other relationship, our connection with him is meant to be a two-way street of love and communication. Tozer says that real religion isn't just about believing the right things, it's about your own personality responding to God's personality.
Okay, but wait a second. That brings up a huge question, right? If God is a person who's always present and wants to be known, why do so many of us feel so far away from him?
And Tozer's answer is, well, it's probably not what you'd expect. He says the problem isn't physical distance. God is everywhere. The barrier isn't out there somewhere in the universe. No, the barrier is a lot closer to home. It's inside our own hearts.
And he has a name for this barrier inside of us, a close-woven veil of the self-life. And notice this isn't about the specific bad things we might do. It's much, much deeper than that. It's the part of our very nature that just insists on being in control, the part of us that's never fully surrendered to God.
And get this is what that veil is actually made of. Tozer calls them hyphenated sins. And you see how they all put self right there in the middle? Now, the truly scary part? He says these things can thrive even in a life that's filled with correct theology and all sorts of religious activity. In fact, our self can actually feed on our own correctness and get even stronger.
And here's the tough part. This isn't something you can just read a book about and fix. Tozer is so clear that this veil is a living piece of us. Tearing it down isn't some intellectual exercise. It's more like painful but totally necessary spiritual surgery. It requires this profound act of surrender, what he calls bringing our self-life to the cross. All right, so if the problem is this internal veil of self, what's the fix? How do we actually deal with this thing? Tozer says the cure has to be an inward act too. So let's look at what he calls the gaze of the soul.
He offers this simple yet really profound practice he calls the gaze of the soul. And this totally reframes what faith even is. See, it's not just a one-time decision you made years ago. It's a continuous, moment-by-moment choice to turn your heart's attention back to God.
Now, this is absolutely crucial. The gaze of the soul is the opposite of self-inspection. Sin has twisted our vision inward, right? So we get obsessed with ourselves, how we're doing, all our flaws. Faith flips that around. It redirects our vision outward, toward God. And the amazing thing is, when we stop trying to fix ourselves and instead just focus on Him, He starts to do the work inside of us.
And the really beautiful thing is just how practical this is. This isn't just for monks hiding away in a monastery. It starts with a simple, conscious decision. Then it's all about building a new habit. In those little in-between moments, waiting in line, driving, taking a walk, you just gently guide your mind back to God. And over time, it becomes a kind of spiritual reflex.
And you know what happens when this inward gaze becomes a habit? It starts to change everything about your outward life. It begins to tear down all those artificial walls we build between the different parts of our existence. All of a sudden, that hard line we draw between sacred and secular starts to get blurry. Like Tozer says here, you can see God from anywhere. Your office, your kitchen, your morning commute. Literally any place can become a sanctuary because you're learning to be aware of God's presence right in the middle of it all. This is what leads to a life that feels whole, integrated instead of fragmented. I think we all have this subtle fear that if we focus too much on God, our lives will get smaller and less interesting. Tozer says the exact opposite is true. When you connect with the source of all joy, all beauty, all love,
you don't lose a thing. You actually gain everything in Him.
So, what's the end game here? Where does this all lead? After all this pursuing, what does this kind of life actually feel like from the inside?
The result is a state of deep inner rest that Tozer, following Jesus, calls meekness. Now, when we hear the word meekness, we usually think of weakness, right? Like being a doormat. But that is not what Tozer means at all. For him, meekness is this profound soul rest that comes when you finally stop fighting to defend yourself and you just accept God's valuation of who you are. Just think for a second about how much energy we burn on pride, protecting our reputation, getting offended, comparing ourselves to everybody else. Tozer says this is an exhausting, heavy burden. The meek person just lays that burden down. They are free because they're no longer trying to manage their own image. They're content to let God be their defender.
And that leaves us with this final, really challenging thought to take with us. In a world that is constantly screaming at us to build ourselves up, to achieve more, to assert ourselves, Tozer's pursuit of God invites us down a totally different path. It's a path where the deepest rest and the truest peace aren't found in self-assertion, but in sweet surrender to God.